Montana Territory, 1872. The iron wheels of the stagecoach thundered over the rough trail, sending Penelope Davenport bouncing against the hard leather seat. Dust filtered through every crack and crevice of the coach, coating her traveling dress with a fine layer of gritty powder. She gripped her reticule tightly with gloved fingers as the vehicle lurched violently to one side, nearly unseating her. "Not much farther now, miss," called the driver from his perch. "Clearwater's just over the next ridge." Penelope nodded, though the man couldn't see her. At 22 years old, she had traveled over 1,000 miles from her home in Boston to this wild territory. Her honey-blonde hair, normally arranged in an elegant chignon, had mostly escaped its pins during the jarring journey. She tried to tuck the wayward strands back into place, but another jolt of the coach defeated her efforts. This land was nothing like the crowded streets of Boston with its brick buildings and gaslights. Here, vast expanses of untamed country stretched in every direction. Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the June heat. Meadows bursting with wildflowers gave way to dense pine forests. It was beautiful but terrifying in its vastness. The letter in her reticule felt heavy, though it was merely a single sheet of paper. The words were burned into her memory after reading them countless times during her journey west. "Miss Davenport, I have received your response to my advertisement and find your qualifications suitable. My ranch is 20 miles outside Clearwater. I will meet you at Hammond's General Store on June 12th. I am 32 years old, own 200 acres, a substantial herd, and require a wife of good Christian character who can manage a household. I trust our arrangement will be mutually beneficial. Regards, Lucas Jameson." It was hardly a romantic proposal, but romance wasn't what had driven Penelope to become a mail-order bride. The financial collapse that had claimed her father's business, and then his life, had left her with few options. Her mother had preceded him to the grave years earlier, and distant relatives had made it clear that their charity extended only so far. When she had seen the advertisement in the newspaper, it had seemed like Providence. The stagecoach crested the ridge, and Clearwater came into view below, a collection of wooden buildings straddling a wide dirt road. Compared to Boston, it was barely a village, yet it represented Penelope's future. As the coach rolled to a stop before a two-story building with a sign proclaiming it the Clearwater Hotel, Penelope gathered her courage along with her small carpetbag. The driver opened the door and she prepared to descend the steep steps. "Watch your step, miss, ground's a mite uneven." He offered his weathered hand. Penelope hesitated before taking it. In Boston, she would have had a footman or her father to assist her. Here, she would need to adapt to new customs, new people. The thought frightened her more than she cared to admit. Her feet touched Montana soil for the first time, and she released the driver's hand, straightening her spine. She refused to appear weak or uncertain before these frontier people. "Hammond's store?" she inquired, gesturing down the street. "Yonder, the big place with the porch." The driver pointed to a sprawling wooden structure. Penelope nodded her thanks and started walking, conscious of curious eyes following her progress. Her blue traveling dress, though dusty, was of fine quality, and her high-buttoned boots were clearly Eastern-made. She might as well have been wearing a sign announcing she was an outsider. Hammond's General Store smelled of coffee, leather, and tobacco. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from canned goods to ammunition. A pot-bellied stove sat cold in the corner, unnecessary in the summer heat. A handful of men in work clothes stood conversing near the counter, falling silent as she entered. An older man with a full beard stepped forward. "Can I help you, miss?" "I am looking for Mr. Lucas Jameson," she said, pleased that her voice betrayed none of her nervousness. The bearded man's eyes widened slightly. "Lucas, he ain't." The door behind Penelope opened, causing the bell above it to jingle. She turned, expecting to see her future husband, a man she had imagined as weathered and stern, like the frontiersmen in the dime novels that had been her only source of information about the West. Instead, she found herself looking up at a young man who couldn't have been more than 25. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt. His Stetson was pushed back, revealing sun-streaked brown hair and eyes the color of the summer sky. A light stubble shadowed his jaw, but his face was youthful beneath the trail dust. "Miss Davenport?" he asked, his deep voice carrying a note of uncertainty. Penelope blinked in confusion. "Yes, but I'm waiting for Mr. Jameson." The young man shifted uncomfortably. "I'm Lucas Jameson." She stared at him, certain there was some mistake. This couldn't be the established rancher who had written to her. But you're so young. A smile flashed across his face, revealing a dimple in his left cheek. Yes, ma'am. 26 last month. Penelope felt heat rise to her face. The letter had said 32. Had it been a deliberate deception? If he had lied about his age, what else might he have misrepresented? Lucas seemed to read her thoughts. I reckon we have some talking to do. He gestured toward the door. There's a cafe next door where we might sit more comfortable like. Penelope hesitated. Everything was wrong. The man before her wasn't the mature, established husband she had expected, yet what choice did she have? Her funds were depleted and Boston held nothing for her but charity or servitude. Very well, Mr. Jameson, she lifted her chin. I believe we do indeed have much to discuss. As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, Penelope stumbled on a warped board. Lucas's hand shot out to steady her, strong fingers gripping her elbow. She pulled away quickly, uncomfortable with the familiarity. I can manage, thank you, she said stiffly. Lucas withdrew his hand as if burned. As you wish, Miss Davenport. The cafe was a simple establishment with checkered cloths covering the tables. A plump woman with graying hair hurried over as they entered. Lucas Jameson, haven't seen you in town for weeks. And who's this pretty lady? Miss Penelope Davenport, Lucas replied. Miss Davenport, this is Mrs. Willoughby. She makes the best apple pie in the territory. The older woman beamed. You two sit yourselves down. Coffee's fresh. Once they were seated and Mrs. Willoughby had brought coffee and slices of pie, Penelope faced Lucas across the table. You misrepresented yourself, Mr. Jameson. Lucas had the grace to look ashamed. Not intentionally, Miss Davenport. My father placed that advertisement before he passed. I continued the correspondence. Your father was Lucas Jameson, Penelope asked, confused. Lucas James Jameson. I'm Lucas John, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. When he died suddenly 3 months ago, I found your letter among his papers. I was going to write and explain, but then I read what you wrote about your own father's passing and how you had no family left. I thought we might suit each other, both being alone. Penelope absorbed this information, stirring her coffee, though she added neither cream nor sugar. So you have inherited your father's ranch. Yes, ma'am. 200 acres, just like the letter said, and I do have a decent herd. Pa built something good, and I've been working it since I was old enough to sit a horse. And you still wish to marry at your age? She couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. Lucas met her eyes directly. The territory's no place to be alone, Miss Davenport. Ranch work needs 4 hands, not 2, and, he added with a touch of defiance, I gave my pa my word I'd see the ranch prosper. That means building something that lasts. A family. Penelope considered him. Despite his youth, his eyes held a seriousness that spoke of responsibility taken on too early. She recognized that look. She'd seen it in her mirror often enough since her father's death. I should tell you, Mr. Jameson, that I know nothing of ranch work. My father was a merchant. I was raised to manage a household, not to wrangle cattle. A smile touched his lips. I don't expect you to wrangle anything, Miss Davenport. Running a ranch house is work enough. And if I decide this arrangement is not suitable after all, what then? Lucas's face sobered. Then I'll pay your way back east, no questions asked. I may have been misleading about my age, but I'm not the kind of man who'd force a woman to stay where she doesn't want to be. The offer surprised her. It also relieved her most immediate fear, being stranded in this wilderness with no means of escape. Still, returning to Boston would only delay the inevitable. Without funds or family, her options remained limited. I propose a compromise, she said after a moment's thought. I will accompany you to your ranch and remain for 1 month. During that time, we will determine if we suit. If at the end of that period, either of us wishes to dissolve the arrangement, you will provide my passage back to Boston. Lucas considered this, then nodded. That seems fair, but I should warn you, Miss Davenport, the ranch is rustic. My pa was more concerned with the cattle than the house. I understand. Penelope doubted she did truly, but she would soon enough. When do we depart? I need to pick up supplies, then we can head out. It's a few hours' ride. He paused. Do you ride, Miss Davenport? She shook her head. Not Western style, certainly. Then you'll ride with me in the wagon. He stood, leaving payment on the table. I'll meet you at the general store in an hour. That'll give you time to refresh yourself if you like. As Penelope watched him leave, she wondered what madness had possessed her to agree to this arrangement. A young rancher in the wilds of Montana Territory was a far cry from the secure future she had envisioned. Yet something about Lucas Jameson's straightforward manner and honest eyes gave her pause. Perhaps this was not the disaster it first appeared. She finished her coffee, steeling herself for what lay ahead. One thing was certain: Penelope Davenport was not a woman who turned back once she had set her course. For better or worse, her future lay in the Montana wilderness. The journey to the Jameson ranch proved every bit as uncomfortable as Penelope had feared. The wagon jolted over the rutted trail, and dust swirled around them despite the canvas covering that protected the supplies. Lucas handled the team of horses with easy competence, but conversation between them was sparse, limited by the noise of the wagon and their mutual uncertainty. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the trail began to climb, winding through stands of pine trees. The air grew cooler and sweeter. When they crested a rise, Lucas pulled the wagon to a halt. "There it is," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "Jameson Ranch." Penelope leaned forward, following his gaze. Below them stretched a green valley, bisected by a meandering creek that glinted silver in the late afternoon sun. A cluster of buildings nestled at the base of a gentle slope, a large log cabin, a barn, and several smaller outbuildings. Beyond them, cattle grazed in fenced pastures that stretched toward distant hills. "It's beautiful," she admitted, surprised by the verdant landscape. She had expected something harsher, more desolate. Lucas nodded, pleased by her reaction. Pa had an eye for good land. The creek never runs dry, even in August, and those hills to the north shelter the valley from the worst winter storms. As they descended into the valley, Penelope's initial impression of beauty was tempered by closer observation of the ranch buildings. The cabin, though substantial, showed signs of neglect. Shutters hung askew and the porch sagged on one side. The barn needed paint and the corral fence had several broken rails. Lucas must have noticed her assessing gaze. "Been busy with the herd since Pa passed, haven't had much time for repairs." There was defensiveness in his tone. "Of course," Penelope murmured, though inwardly she wondered what she had gotten herself into. In Boston, her father had employed servants to maintain their home. Here, it seemed, such tasks would fall to her and Lucas alone. As the wagon pulled up before the cabin, the door swung open and an elderly man emerged. Stooped and white-haired, he walked with the aid of a carved stick. "'Bout time you got back, boy," he called. "Was beginning to think you'd run off with the supply money." "As if I'd dare, Pops," Lucas replied good-naturedly. He turned to Penelope. "Miss Davenport, this is Ezekiel Hansen. Pops has been with the ranch since before I was born." The old man peered at Penelope with rheumy eyes. "So you're the mail-order bride." It wasn't a question. "Prettier than I expected." "Too pretty for this hardscrabble life, if you ask me." "Pops," Lucas admonished, "it's quite all right, Mr. Jameson." Penelope inclined her head toward Ezekiel. "I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Hansen. And I assure you I'm stronger than I appear." The old man grunted, seemingly unconvinced, but hobbled forward to help unload the wagon. Despite his age and infirmity, he moved with purpose, directing Lucas in the storage of the supplies with the authority of long familiarity. Penelope stood uncertainly by the wagon, unsure of her place in this strange new world. Finally, Lucas approached her, wiping his hands on his denims. "Let me show you the house," he said, the formality in his tone betraying his nervousness. The cabin's interior was a single large room with a loft above. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a rough-hewn table with benches occupied the center of the space. A cast-iron cookstove stood in one corner, and shelves lined the walls, holding an assortment of dishes, tools, and books, more books than Penelope had expected to see in a frontier home. The furnishings were utilitarian but solid: a rocking chair by the fireplace, a cupboard for food storage, a sideboard that had seen better days. Everything was reasonably clean but showed the neglect of a household without a woman's touch. Dust had collected in corners and the windows were grimy. "Pa's room is through there," Lucas said, pointing to a door at the back of the cabin. "It's yours now. I sleep in the loft." Penelope nodded, relieved that she would have some privacy. "And Mr. Hansen?" "Pops has a cabin of his own just behind the barn. He prefers it that way." Lucas shifted uncomfortably. "I know it's not what you're used to." "Few things here are, Mr. Jameson," she replied evenly. But I did not expect luxury when I answered your father's advertisement. Lucas smiled slightly at that. No, I suppose not. He hesitated, then added, I'll bring your bags in, and then I need to see to the livestock. Supper's usually at sundown. Left alone in the cabin, Penelope took stock of her new domain. The bedroom was small but clean, containing a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. A small window looked out toward the creek. She unpacked her few possessions, arranging them carefully in the drawers. Her wardrobe, suitable for Boston society, seemed absurdly impractical here. She had brought one sensible work dress, anticipating some domestic duties, but nothing that prepared her for the realities of ranch life. When she had finished unpacking, Penelope rolled up her sleeves and set to work cleaning the cabin. If this was to be her home for at least a month, she would not live in squalor. She found cleaning supplies in a cupboard and began with the windows, letting light stream into the dusty interior. By the time the men returned for supper, she had swept the floors, dusted the shelves, and scoured the cook stove. She was heating water for washing dishes when the door opened, admitting Lucas, Ezekiel, and the smell of horses and hard work. They stopped short at the threshold, surveying the transformed space. Well, I'll be, Ezekiel muttered. Cabin hasn't looked this good since Lucas's ma was alive. Lucas said nothing, but his eyes met Penelope's with a mixture of surprise and gratitude that made her cheeks warm. I've taken the liberty of preparing supper, she said, gesturing to the pot of beans and bacon she had found and reheated. It's not much, I'm afraid. It's more than we usually manage, Lucas replied. Thank you. They ate at the table, the men devouring the simple food with appreciation that both pleased and dismayed Penelope. If this constituted a feast, what had they been eating before her arrival? As they ate, Lucas spoke of ranch matters, fences that needed mending, a mare about to foal, plans for moving part of the herd to summer pasture. Ezekiel contributed occasionally, his gruff manner softening as the meal progressed. Penelope listened, trying to understand this new world. The language of ranching was foreign to her. Talk of branding, breaking horses, and beef prices meant little. Yet she recognized the underlying concerns, the need to protect one's livelihood, to plan for the future, to build something lasting. When the meal was finished, she rose to clear the dishes. Lucas stood as well, reaching for his hat. I need to check on that mare before turning in, he said. Pops, you'll help Miss Davenport get settled. The old man nodded, remaining at the table as Lucas left. When the door closed behind him, Ezekiel fixed Penelope with a penetrating gaze. He's a good boy, he said abruptly. Works harder than two men. Been running this place since he was 17, truth be told. His pa was more idea than action toward the end. Penelope paused in her clearing of the table. You've known Lucas all his life. Delivered him myself when the midwife couldn't get here in time. Pride tinged the old man's voice. Watched him grow from a spindly boy to the man he is now. Why did his father advertise for a bride? Penelope asked, her curiosity overcoming her reserve. Surely there are unmarried women in the territory. Ezekiel snorted. Few that would take on a hardscrabble ranch and a man old enough to be their father. He shook his head. Old Lucas was always looking for the easy way, figured a desperate Eastern woman would be less trouble than courting locally. The blunt assessment made Penelope wince, though she couldn't deny the accuracy of desperate in her case. And young Lucas, she asked, does he share his father's views? That boy, Ezekiel's weathered face softened. No, he believes in earning what he gets, but he's also loyal to a fault. When his pa died, Lucas took on all his obligations, including you, miss. I am not an obligation, Mr. Hanson, Penelope said stiffly. Our arrangement is conditional and may yet be dissolved. The old man regarded her thoughtfully. Maybe so, but I've seen how he looks at you already, like your water in the desert. He pushed himself up from the table. Just remember, miss, out here a man's word is all he has. If Lucas says he'll do right by you, he will, whether you stay or go. With that parting shot, he hobbled to the door, leaving Penelope alone with her thoughts and a stack of dirty dishes. Later, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the night sounds of the prairie, Penelope tried to make sense of her situation. Lucas Jameson was not the husband she had expected. Younger, less established, yet possessing a quiet determination that commanded respect. The ranch was more primitive than she had imagined, the work clearly overwhelming for one man, even with Ezekiel's limited assistance. And what of her own place here? She had skills suitable for an Eastern parlor. She could play the pianoforte, embroider, and converse in French, none of which seemed particularly useful in the Montana wilderness. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, Penelope found herself recalling Lucas's face when he'd seen the cleaned cabin, the flash of hope in his blue eyes quickly concealed. Perhaps there was a place for her here after all, if she were brave enough to claim it. The first week at Jameson Ranch passed in a blur of discovery and adjustment for Penelope. Each morning she woke before dawn to the sounds of Lucas moving about the cabin, building the fire and preparing for his day's work. By the time she descended from the loft, he was usually gone, leaving behind a pot of coffee and sometimes fresh milk from their single dairy cow. She established a routine, cleaning, mending, taking inventory of the household supplies. The pantry was woefully understocked, with little beyond beans, flour, coffee, and salt pork. The garden behind the cabin had gone to seed, choked with weeds that she began to clear, hoping to salvage some vegetables. Lucas returned at midday for a quick meal, then worked until sundown or later. Their conversations remained stilted, limited to practical matters. He was unfailingly polite but maintained a careful distance, as if afraid of presuming too much. Penelope found herself watching him when he wasn't aware, the confident way he handled the horses, the gentleness he showed to a newborn calf, the quiet authority with which he directed the few ranch hands who appeared occasionally to help with larger tasks. Despite his youth, he carried himself with the assurance of a man comfortable in his own skin and place. On her 8th day at the ranch, Penelope decided to bake bread. The stale loaves purchased in town were gone, and she had discovered a crock of sourdough starter in the root cellar. Her mother had never allowed her in the kitchen in Boston. They had a cook for such tasks, but Penelope had a practical nature and a book of household management among her possessions. The first attempt was a disaster, dense and undercooked. The second, prepared the following day, was somewhat better. By the third day, she produced a loaf that, while not perfect, was certainly edible. When Lucas came in for the midday meal, she placed it on the table with nervous pride. "You baked bread?" he asked, surprise evident in his voice. "I thought we could use some fresh," she replied. "It's not as good as a professional baker's, I'm afraid." Lucas broke off a piece, steam rising as he did so. He chewed thoughtfully, then looked up with a genuine smile. "It's good, real good, Miss Davenport." The simple praise warmed her more than it should have. "Thank you, and please, after more than a week of shared meals, I think you might call me Penelope." Something flickered in his eyes, pleasure, perhaps, or surprise at the overture. "Penelope, then, and I'm Lucas to everyone except the banker in town." Their eyes held for a moment, and Penelope felt a strange flutter in her chest. She looked away first, busying herself with ladling stew into bowls. "I've been meaning to ask," she said as they ate, "about the garden. It seems salvageable, but I'm not sure what grows well here." Lucas nodded. "My mother kept a good garden. Potatoes, carrots, turnips do well, peas and beans too. Corn struggles with our short growing season, but she always tried a few rows anyway." "Your mother," Penelope ventured carefully. "Ezekiel mentioned she passed away when you were young." "I was 12, his face closed slightly. "Fever took her, doctor couldn't get here in time from town." "I'm sorry," she hesitated, then added, "I lost my mother at 14, consumption." Lucas looked up, surprise and something like recognition in his eyes. "It changes you, doesn't it, growing up without a mother?" "Yes," Penelope agreed softly, "it does." A silence fell between them, but it was different from their previous awkward pauses, more companionable, built on shared understanding. "There are seeds," Lucas said after a moment, "in the storehouse from her last garden. They might still be good." "I'd like to try them," Penelope said, "if you don't mind." "I don't mind," he hesitated, then added, "she would have liked that." Seeing the garden grow again. That afternoon, Lucas showed her to the storehouse, a small structure near the cabin. Inside, shelves held tools, leatherworking supplies, and miscellaneous equipment. From a high shelf, he retrieved a wooden box with a sliding lid. "Here they are," he said, handing it to her. She kept them sorted in paper packets, used to start planning next year's garden before this year's harvest was done. Penelope opened the box carefully. Inside lay dozens of small packets, each labeled in a neat feminine hand: sugar snap peas, winter squash, Roma tomatoes. The paper was yellowing at the edges, but the seeds inside looked intact. Thank you for sharing these with me, she said, touched by the gesture. These seeds were a connection to the woman who had made this place a home before her, a woman Lucas had loved and lost. They're just sitting here otherwise, he replied with a shrug, but his eyes told a different story. Over the next few days, Penelope devoted herself to reclaiming the garden. The work was harder than anything she had ever done, breaking up the sun-hardened soil, pulling stubborn weeds, hauling water from the creek. By evening, her hands were blistered, her back ached, and her fair skin had reddened despite the wide-brimmed hat she wore. Yet there was satisfaction in the work that surprised her. Each cleared row represented progress, visible and tangible. When she planted the first seeds, peas and lettuce that could withstand the occasional late frost, she felt an unexpected connection to the land. Lucas noticed her efforts but said little. One morning, however, she emerged from the cabin to find a stack of straight branches by the garden and a ball of twine, supports for the pea vines she had planted. Another day, she returned from hanging laundry to discover that someone had installed a rain barrel at the corner of the cabin, positioned to catch water from the roof and save her trips to the creek. These quiet kindnesses touched Penelope more deeply than grand gestures might have. They spoke of attention paid, needs anticipated. They suggested that perhaps Lucas was watching her as carefully as she watched him. 2 weeks into her stay, disaster struck. Penelope was hanging laundry when she heard shouting from the direction of the corral. She hurried around the cabin to see Lucas on the ground, clutching his leg, while two ranch hands struggled to control a half-broken horse that had clearly thrown him. Without thinking, she ran to where he lay, kneeling beside him on the dusty ground. "Are you hurt? What happened?" Lucas grimaced, his face pale beneath his tan. "Stepped wrong when I came off. Ankle's bad." Ezekiel appeared, moving faster than Penelope had seen him move before. "Fool boy," he muttered, kneeling to examine Lucas's leg. "Told you that mare wasn't ready." "Can you stand?" Penelope asked, her heart racing with concern. "Have to," Lucas said through gritted teeth, but when he tried to put weight on the injured ankle, he went white with pain. "Help me get him to the house," Penelope commanded, taking charge without conscious thought. She positioned herself under one of Lucas's arms while Ezekiel took the other side. Together, they half-carried him to the cabin and maneuvered him onto his bed in the small bedroom. Penelope sent one of the ranch hands for ice from the spring house, while she carefully removed Lucas's boot. The ankle was already swelling, turning an angry purple. "It needs to be wrapped," she said, remembering how her father's valet had tended him after a riding accident, "and you'll need to stay off it for at least a few days." Lucas shook his head. "Can't, spring roundup starts tomorrow. I need to be in the saddle." "You won't be in any saddle with that ankle," Ezekiel stated flatly. "Boy, you're lucky it's not broken." "The herd." "We'll have to wait," Penelope interrupted firmly. "Or the men will have to manage without you." Lucas looked between them, frustration evident on his face. "We're already behind schedule, if we don't get the cattle to summer pasture soon." "Then instruct the men properly and trust them to do their jobs," Penelope said, her voice gentler but no less determined. A battle waged in Lucas's eyes, pride versus practicality. Finally, practicality won. "Fine, but only for 2 days, that's all we can spare." Penelope hid her relief, 2 days with complete rest. "Then we'll see." For the next 2 days, Lucas was confined to the cabin, his ankle elevated and wrapped in cold compresses that Penelope changed regularly. He chafed at the inactivity, alternating between moody silence and anxious questions whenever one of the ranch hands returned with updates. Penelope found herself in the unaccustomed role of nurse and mediator, tending to his injury while also buffering between his frustration and Ezekiel's gruff admonishments. The close quarters and forced intimacy pushed them beyond their usual careful interactions. On the evening of the first day, as she brought him supper on a tray, Lucas caught her wrist gently. "I'm sorry to be such a difficult patient." Penelope was startled by both the touch and the apology. "You're not difficult, you're worried about your livelihood, I understand that." "Still," he persisted, "you didn't sign on to nurse an injured rancher." She smiled slightly. "Actually, I believe caring for a husband in sickness and health was explicitly mentioned in your father's advertisement." The moment she said it, Penelope regretted the reference to their arrangement, which both had carefully avoided discussing since her arrival. Lucas released her wrist, a shadow crossing his face. "We never did talk about that," he said quietly. "Our arrangement." Penelope sat on the edge of the chair beside the bed, smoothing her apron nervously. No, we didn't. Your month is half over, Lucas observed, his tone carefully neutral. Have you decided whether you'll stay? She looked at him, trying to read his expression in the lamplight. Did he want her to stay? His eyes revealed nothing, guarded as they were. I haven't decided, she admitted. This life is very different from what I expected. Harder, he supplied. Yes, she acknowledged, but also rewarding in ways I hadn't anticipated. She thought of the garden, the satisfaction of bread baked by her own hands, the quiet evenings by the fire when Lucas would sometimes read aloud from one of his books. Lucas nodded, seeming to understand. And our potential marriage, have you given that any thought? Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks. In truth, she had thought of little else for days. The prospect of becoming Lucas Jameson's wife had evolved from a practical necessity to something more complex. She found herself drawn to his quiet strength, his dedication to the ranch, the gentleness that belied his rugged exterior. But were those feelings enough to build a marriage upon? I have, she said carefully, but I'm not ready to decide yet. Fair enough, his voice was even, revealing nothing of his own thoughts on the matter. The offer stands either way. Marriage or passage back to Boston. Thank you, she stood, needing to put distance between them. You should eat before your supper gets cold. As she turned to leave, Lucas spoke again. Penelope. She paused at the doorway, looking back. I'm glad you're here, he said simply. Whatever you decide. The words followed her as she went about her evening chores, stirring emotions she wasn't ready to examine too closely. By the third day, Lucas insisted on getting up despite Penelope's protests. His ankle was still swollen, but he could bear some weight on it. He hobbled out to the porch, where he could at least observe the ranch activities and give directions to the hands who came to report. Penelope brought him lunch on the porch, sitting beside him on the rough-hewn bench. The garden is coming along, she said, gesturing to the neat rows now visible behind the cabin. Some of the lettuce is already sprouting. Lucas smiled, the expression transforming his face, erasing the worry lines that had formed during his confinement. You've worked hard on it. I've never grown anything before, she admitted. It's quite miraculous, really, seeing life emerge from those tiny seeds. That's ranching in a way, Lucas reflected. Planting seeds, nurturing growth, whether it's gardens or cattle herds or... He trailed off, but his eyes held hers meaningfully. Or families, she finished softly. He nodded, a faint flush touching his cheeks. Yes. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. The spring air was sweet with the scent of wildflowers, and in the distance, the mountains stood sharp against the clear blue sky. I never thought I could belong in a place like this, Penelope said thoughtfully. It seemed so alien when I first arrived. And now, Lucas asked, a note of hope in his voice. She considered the question seriously. Now I'm beginning to see its beauty, its possibilities. Lucas's hand moved across the bench, coming to rest beside hers, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Possibilities are good, he said quietly. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was coming fast down the trail from town, raising dust as he came. Lucas stood, wincing as he put weight on his injured ankle. Something's wrong. The rider, one of the younger ranch hands named Tim, reined his lathered horse to a stop before the porch. Mr. Jameson, there's trouble. Elkins and his men are moving their herd across your north pasture. Lucas's face hardened. What, that's my land? Yes, sir, they cut the fence in 3 places. Said something about a new survey showing it was open range. Penelope watched as Lucas's hands clenched into fists. Saddle my horse, he ordered. Lucas, your ankle, she protested. You can barely walk. I can ride, he replied grimly. This is about more than a fence, Penelope. Elkins has been trying to push me off this land since Pa died. He thinks because I'm young, I'll be easy to intimidate. Then send the men, she argued. You don't have to go yourself. Lucas turned to her, determination etched in every line of his face. Yes, I do. A rancher defends what's his. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the immediate crisis. Penelope recognized the battle in his eyes, not just for land but for respect, for the right to claim his place in this harsh territory. Then I'm coming with you, she said, surprising herself as much as Lucas. Absolutely not, he replied immediately. It could be dangerous. You're injured, she countered. Someone should be with you in case your ankle gives out. And, she added with a touch of defiance, I have a stake in this too, if I'm to consider making this ranch my home. Lucas stared at her for a long moment, conflict evident in his expression. Finally he gave a short nod. Fine. But you stay behind me, and if there's trouble, you ride straight back here. Within minutes they were mounted, Lucas on his rangy bay gelding. Penelope somewhat unsteadily on a gentle mare that Ezekiel assured her could be ridden by a child. The old man himself stayed behind, muttering about fool notions, but handing Penelope a canteen of water with gruff instructions to keep that stubborn boy from doing anything stupider than he already has. The ride to the north pasture was tense and largely silent. Lucas was clearly in pain, though he tried to hide it, and Penelope was concentrating too hard on staying in the saddle to make conversation. She had ridden in Boston, but always side saddle, and never across open country at this pace. When they crested a rise and the north pasture came into view, Lucas reined in his horse sharply. Below them, a large herd of cattle was being driven across what Penelope assumed was Jameson land. Men on horseback moved around the edges of the herd, keeping the animals together as they headed toward a gap in the fence line. Elkins, Lucas muttered, pointing to a heavy-set man on a black horse who seemed to be directing the operation. Owns the next ranch over, been trying to expand for years. Why would he think this is his land? Penelope asked, trying to understand the situation. Lucas's jaw tightened. He doesn't. But he knows the original survey markers for this section are old and some are missing. If he can create confusion about the boundary, he might be able to claim this pasture through adverse possession. That's theft, Penelope said indignantly. That's ranching politics, Lucas corrected grimly. Stay here, I'm going to talk to him. Before she could protest, he urged his horse forward, descending the slope toward the herd. Penelope watched anxiously as he approached the group of riders. Even from a distance, she could see the confrontational stance of the men as Lucas reached them. Voices carried on the clear air, too indistinct for her to make out words, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. She saw Lucas gesture emphatically, pointing toward the cut fence. Elkins responded with what appeared to be a dismissive wave of his hand. The tension in the scene was palpable, and Penelope felt her heart racing. She had never witnessed such a confrontation. In Boston, disputes were handled through lawyers and courts, not face-to-face in open country with guns visible on men's hips. Suddenly, one of Elkins's men moved his horse forward aggressively, causing Lucas's mount to shy. Lucas, already unsteady with his injured ankle, lost his balance and fell heavily to the ground. Without thinking, Penelope kicked her horse into motion, descending the slope as quickly as she dared. As she approached, she could hear Elkins laughing while Lucas struggled to rise, clearly in pain. Well, well, Elkins called as he noticed her approach. What have we here, Jameson, you hiring women hands now? Ranch must be in worse shape than I thought. Penelope reined in beside Lucas, who had managed to get to his feet. His face was tight with pain and anger, but she saw a flash of concern when he realized she had disobeyed his instruction to stay back. This is Miss Davenport, Lucas said tightly. My fiancée. The word sent a shock through Penelope, but she controlled her expression, lifting her chin and meeting Elkins's surprised gaze directly. Mr. Elkins, she acknowledged coolly. I understand you're trespassing on our property. Elkins recovered from his surprise quickly, a smirk spreading across his fleshy face. Your property? Well, that's the question, isn't it? My new survey says different. Your survey is convenient fiction, Lucas replied. These boundary lines have been established for 20 years. Things change, boy, Elkins said dismissively. Your pa knew when to compromise. You'd be wise to learn the same. Penelope noticed Lucas's hand drift toward the gun at his hip. Alarmed, she placed her hand on his arm. Lucas, there are better ways to resolve this. He glanced at her, conflict evident in his eyes. Listen to your woman, Jameson, Elkins taunted. You're outnumbered anyway. Penelope's mind raced. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Lucas was in no condition for either a fight or a hasty retreat. She needed to diffuse the tension. Mr. Elkins, she said clearly, I assume you registered this new survey with the Territorial Land Office. The question seemed to catch him off guard. What? The survey, she repeated. If it redefines property lines, it would need official registration. My father was involved in commercial real estate, she added, stretching the truth considerably. I understand these matters. Elkins shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. It's being processed. I see, Penelope nodded as if considering this information seriously. Then you would have no objection to withdrawing your cattle until the matter is officially resolved. After all, if you're found to be trespassing, the penalties could be quite severe, including, she added with confidence she didn't entirely feel, criminal charges for destruction of property. She gestured to the cut fence. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Elkins's face. He glanced at his men, then back at Penelope and Lucas. This ain't over, Jameson, he said finally. You can't hide behind a woman's skirts forever. I'm not hiding, Lucas replied evenly. And I'm not selling or surrendering any part of my land. Not now, not ever. Elkins spat on the ground near Lucas's feet. We'll see about that. He wheeled his horse around. Boys, move the herd back. For now, as Elkins and his men began redirecting the cattle, Lucas turned to Penelope, astonishment and admiration mingling in his expression. That was impressive. She released a shaky breath, the bravado that had carried her through the confrontation fading now that the danger had passed. I wasn't sure it would work. It might not have with some men, Lucas admitted, but Elkins is a bully, not a fool. He knows a legal challenge could cost him. Will he come back? She asked, watching the retreating herd. Lucas nodded grimly, eventually, but we've bought time. He looked down at his ankle, which was clearly paining him more after the fall. We should get back to the ranch. As they rode slowly homeward, side by side this time, Lucas cleared his throat. About what I said back there, calling you my fiancé, I didn't mean to presume. It was the right thing to say, Penelope interrupted gently. It gave me standing in the conversation. Still, he persisted, I don't want you to think I was trying to force your hand or rush your decision. She glanced at him, noting the earnest concern in his eyes. I didn't think that, she assured him. Good, he hesitated, then added, for what it's worth, I was proud to introduce you that way. You were magnificent, standing up to Elkins like that. Penelope felt a blush warm her cheeks. I was terrified, she admitted. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Lucas said quietly. It's acting despite it. The simple wisdom of his words struck her. This young rancher, whom she had initially dismissed as too inexperienced, continued to reveal depths that surprised and moved her. They rode in companionable silence for a while, each lost in thought. The encounter with Elkins had changed something between them, crystallized a partnership that had been slowly forming through shared work and proximity. As the ranch buildings came into view, Lucas spoke again. Penelope, I know you still have time to decide, but I want you to know that I hope you'll stay. Not just because the ranch needs a woman's touch or because I gave my father my word. But because, he hesitated, seeming to search for the right words. Because, she prompted gently, because I've come to care for you, he said simply, more than I expected to. More than makes sense after so short a time. The admission hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Penelope felt something shift inside her, a recognition of her own growing feelings, a hope she had barely allowed herself to acknowledge. I care for you too, Lucas, she replied softly, and I'm not ready to leave, not yet. It wasn't a promise of forever, but it was a beginning. As they approached the ranch yard, where Ezekiel waited anxiously on the porch, Penelope realized that somehow, in the space of 3 weeks, this remote Montana ranch had begun to feel like something she had never truly had before. It had begun to feel like home. The encounter with Elkins changed the rhythm of life at the Jameson ranch. Lucas, forced to rest his ankle for several more days, reluctantly delegated more responsibility to his ranch hands. Penelope found herself serving as his proxy, carrying messages and reports between the injured rancher and his men. This new role gave her insights into the business side of ranching, the complex calculations of grazing rotation, the timing of breeding and calving, the constant vigilance against disease and predators. Lucas proved to be a patient teacher, explaining each decision and the reasoning behind it. You have a good head for this, he remarked one evening as they reviewed the tally of spring calves, better than my father ever did. He was always more interested in expansion than management. Penelope smiled at the compliment. My father believed a woman should understand business, even if society deemed it improper. He used to say that fortunes are lost when widows can't read ledgers. Smart man, Lucas observed. Yes, she agreed softly, though his own business failed in the end. The war disrupted shipping, and he made some desperate investments trying to recover. Lucas's hand covered hers briefly on the table. I'm sorry. The gentle touch sent warmth through her. Such moments of casual intimacy had become more frequent between them since the confrontation with Elkins, a hand at her elbow as she descended the porch steps, fingers brushing as they passed items at the dinner table, a steadying arm when she stumbled on uneven ground. Each touch, though innocent, seemed charged with meaning, tentative explorations of the changing relationship between them. Penelope found herself both anticipating and anxious about these moments, her body responding in ways that both thrilled and unsettled her. As Lucas's ankle healed and he resumed more of his duties, Penelope turned her attention to improvements around the cabin. With Ezekiel's grudging assistance, she hung new curtains fashioned from fabric found in a trunk, repaired the sagging porch steps, and thoroughly cleaned every corner of the small home. The garden flourished under her care, tender green shoots pushing through the soil in neat rows. She found unexpected joy in the simple act of nurturing growth, of coaxing life from the earth with her own hands. In Boston, she had arranged flowers but never planted them. Here, she was learning the satisfaction of creation from its most fundamental beginnings. One afternoon, as she weeded between rows of young peas, Lucas approached from the barn, leading a horse she hadn't seen before, a gentle-looking sorrel mare with a white blaze on her forehead. I thought you might like to learn to ride properly, he said, stopping at the garden's edge. Now that I can ride alongside you. Side saddle isn't practical for ranch life, and Buttercup here has the smoothest gait of any horse I've ever owned. Penelope stood, brushing soil from her apron. Is this another of your mother's legacies? She asked, stepping forward to stroke the mare's velvety nose. A shadow crossed Lucas's face. No, this is new. He hesitated, then added, I bought her in town yesterday. For you. The implication of the gift wasn't lost on Penelope. A horse was a significant investment, and purchasing one specifically for her suggested expectations of permanence that they hadn't yet discussed directly. Lucas, she began uncertainly, I haven't decided. I know, he interrupted gently, and this doesn't change that. If you choose to return to Boston, I'll find another use for Buttercup. But if you stay, he shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. A rancher's wife needs her own mount. The term wife hung between them, heavy with possibility. Penelope reached out to take the reins he offered, her fingers brushing his in the process. Thank you, she said softly. She's beautiful. Like her owner, Lucas replied, then flushed slightly at his own boldness. Penelope felt her own cheeks warm. I'm hardly her owner yet. No, he agreed, his blue eyes holding her steadily. But I hope you will be, both the horse and the title that comes with her. The directness of his statement took her breath away. In Boston, courtship proceeded along carefully prescribed lines, chaperoned walks, formal calls, discussions of settlements and arrangements. Here, standing in a half-planted garden with dirt under her fingernails, Lucas Jameson was offering his heart with the same straightforward honesty he brought to everything. Lucas, she began, uncertain what she wanted to say. He shook his head. You don't need to answer now. Your month isn't up for another week. He handed her the reins fully. But I wanted you to know where I stand. I want you to stay Penelope. Not just as my wife in name, but as my partner in everything. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. 3 men were coming up the trail toward the ranch, the local doctor, recognizable by his black bag, and 2 strangers. Lucas frowned. I didn't send for Doc Wilson. As the riders approached, Penelope saw that one of the strangers was older, distinguished-looking with silver at his temples and an expensive Eastern-cut suit that looked out of place on the Montana Trail. The other was younger, perhaps 30, with a trim beard and the unmistakable bearing of a man accustomed to authority. Lucas Jameson, the older man called as they reined in before the house. Lucas stepped forward, subtly positioning himself between the strangers and Penelope. That's me. The man dismounted with the ease of someone more familiar with horses than his attire suggested. My name is Howard Davenport. I believe you have my niece. Penelope gasped, the reins slipping from her suddenly nerveless fingers. Uncle Howard. The man turned, his expression softening as he took in her appearance, the simple work dress, the apron, the soil on her hands. Penelope, thank God we found you. Lucas looked between them, confusion evident on his face. Sir, I don't understand. Penelope came here of her own free will as a mail-order bride. Howard Davenport's face hardened. Yes, after being manipulated and taken advantage of in her grief. A young woman of her standing, reduced to such desperate measures, it's unconscionable. Uncle Howard, that's not what happened, Penelope began, but the older man continued as if she hadn't spoken. We've been searching for her for weeks. Your Mr. Elkins was good enough to direct us here when we inquired in town. Lucas's expression darkened at the mention of Elkins. Of course he was. The younger man dismounted now, moving to stand beside Howard. Miss Davenport, are you unharmed? He asked, his tone solicitous but his eyes cold as they assessed Lucas. I'm perfectly well, Mr. Richardson, she replied, recognizing her uncle's business partner, but I don't understand why you've come all this way. To bring you home, of course, Howard said, as if it were obvious. When we discovered you had responded to an advertisement for a mail-order bride, well, we knew you must have been desperate indeed, but you needn't worry any longer. We've come to take you back to civilization. Lucas's face had gone very still. I think that's for Penelope to decide, he said quietly. Howard Davenport gave him a dismissive glance. Young man, you can have no conception of my niece's proper place in society. This arrangement was clearly made in a moment of desperation. That's not true, Penelope protested, finding her voice at last. I made a reasoned decision based on my circumstances. Circumstances we are prepared to improve, Richardson interjected smoothly. Your uncle has successfully challenged your father's final business dealings. There is now a modest sum available for your support, enough to establish you properly in Boston society once again. The news struck Penelope like a physical blow. All those months of despair after her father's death, the creditors hounding her, the pitying looks from former friends, and now, suddenly, there was money. Now there was a place for her in Boston. Lucas must have read the shock on her face. His eyes met hers, a question in their blue depths. Penelope, he said softly. Before she could respond, Doc Wilson, who had remained mounted during this exchange, cleared his throat. I hate to interrupt this family reunion, but I was brought along to examine the young lady and ensure she's fit for travel. That won't be necessary, Penelope said firmly. I'm in perfect health. Nevertheless, Howard insisted, we would feel better with medical confirmation. The journey back east is arduous. Penelope felt her temper rising at being discussed, as if she were a child or an invalid. Uncle Howard, I am not planning any journey east at present. I have made commitments here that I intend to honor. Her uncle's expression hardened. Penelope, I understand you feel some misplaced obligation to this situation you found yourself in, but surely you can't mean to remain here in this wilderness when you could return to your rightful place in society. My rightful place, she repeated, anger giving her words a sharp edge. You mean the place you and Aunt Margaret offered me after Father died, a room in the servants' quarters and the expectation that I would serve as unpaid companion to your daughters. Howard had the grace to look uncomfortable. The circumstances were difficult then, things have changed. Yes, they have, Penelope agreed, I have changed. She moved to stand beside Lucas, drawing strength from his solid presence. I've found purpose here. Work that matters. Richardson stepped forward, his manner conciliatory. Miss Davenport, no one doubts that you've shown remarkable adaptability in these unfortunate circumstances, but surely you can't prefer this primitive existence to the comforts and opportunities of Boston. Lucas, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. Sir, with all due respect, Penelope isn't being held here against her will. She's free to go if that's her choice. The simple statement, devoid of protest or persuasion, touched Penelope deeply. Even now, faced with losing her, Lucas was putting her freedom of choice above his own desires. Howard Davenport looked around the ranch yard with undisguised disdain, taking in the weathered buildings, the muddy corral, the half-planted garden. You expect me to believe my niece, raised in the finest circles of Boston society, would willingly choose this life? I expect you to ask her, Lucas replied evenly. And to respect her answer. All eyes turned to Penelope, who suddenly found herself at the center of a decision she had thought she still had a week to make. Boston with its familiar comforts and social standing, or Montana with its harsh beauty and the man who stood beside her now, offering partnership rather than protection. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is unexpected." Howard frowned. "Penelope." "One day," she interrupted. "Surely you can give me that much, Uncle Howard. Stay in town tonight and I will give you my answer tomorrow." Her uncle looked as if he wanted to argue, but Richardson placed a restraining hand on his arm. "That seems reasonable," the younger man said smoothly. "We've come a long way. One more day won't matter." After a moment's hesitation, Howard nodded. "Very well, tomorrow then." He fixed Lucas with a hard stare. "Young man, I hold you responsible for my niece's well-being until then." Lucas met his gaze steadily. "Sir, I've held myself responsible for Penelope's well-being since the day she arrived." The visitors departed shortly after, Doc Wilson never having had reason to open his bag. As the sound of their horses faded down the trail, Penelope remained standing in the yard, her thoughts in turmoil. Lucas approached cautiously, keeping a respectful distance. "Are you all right?" She shook her head, not in negation but in bewilderment. "I don't know, I never expected. I thought that part of my life was over." "And now it doesn't have to be," Lucas said quietly. "You can go back." Penelope looked at him sharply. "Do you want me to go?" "No," the word was immediate and emphatic. "God, no, Penelope, but I want you to choose freely, not out of desperation or lack of options." The honesty in his voice moved her. "And if I choose to stay?" "Then I'll be the happiest man in the territory." A small smile touched his lips. "And the most envied, I imagine, once word gets around that I won the hand of a Boston society lady." Despite the turmoil of her emotions, Penelope found herself smiling in return. "I was hardly at the pinnacle of society, Lucas." "Higher than anyone in Clearwater's likely to meet," he countered. Then more seriously, "But that's not why I want you to stay." "Why do you then?" she asked, needing to hear it. Lucas took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because in the short time you've been here, you've transformed this place from a ranch to a home. Because you face every challenge with courage and determination. Because when you smile, the whole world seems brighter." He took another step. "Because I'm falling in love with you, Penelope Davenport, and the thought of watching you ride away tomorrow makes me feel like I can't breathe." The declaration, so simple and direct, brought tears to Penelope's eyes. No man had ever spoken to her with such unvarnished honesty, such clear intent. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice catching. He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and took her hand in his. "I won't ask you to answer now," he said gently. "This is a big decision. Take the night, think, pray if you're of that mind. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." Penelope nodded, grateful for the understanding even as her heart pulled in opposing directions. "Thank you." That night sleep eluded her. She lay in the small bedroom that had become hers, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the occasional lowing of cattle in the distant pasture, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, the call of a coyote on the ridge. Sounds that had seemed alien and threatening when she first arrived now formed a familiar lullaby that normally soothed her to sleep. Tonight, however, her mind was too full for rest. She thought of Boston, the elegant townhouse where she had grown up, the familiar rhythms of society, the cultural amenities she had taken for granted until they were gone. She thought of her friends there, many of whom had distanced themselves after her father's financial disgrace. Then she thought of Montana, the vast open spaces that had initially terrified her but now represented freedom, the hard work that left her exhausted but satisfied, the simple pleasures of a meal cooked over a fire or a sunset viewed from the porch. Most of all, she thought of Lucas, his quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, the way his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking. Sometime in the darkest hours before dawn, Penelope rose and wrapped herself in a shawl. She moved quietly through the cabin, careful not to wake Lucas, who slept in the loft above. Stepping onto the porch, she was greeted by a sky ablaze with stars, more stars than she had ever imagined possible, brilliant against the velvet blackness. As she stood gazing upward, the door opened behind her. Lucas emerged, pulling a jacket over his nightshirt. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "Too much to think about." He moved to stand beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. The stars help sometimes put things in perspective. Penelope nodded, appreciating that he didn't press her for a decision or try to persuade her. They make me feel small, she admitted, but not in a frightening way, more like a reminder that my problems aren't as big as they seem. That's a good way of looking at it. Lucas tilted his head back, his profile strong against the night sky. My mother used to say that stars are God's way of reminding us that beauty can exist in darkness. The simple wisdom touched Penelope. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was, Lucas agreed softly. She would have liked you. The comment warmed her. Tell me more about her, Penelope requested, realizing how little she knew about the woman who had shaped Lucas's early years. Lucas leaned against the porch rail, his eyes on the distant horizon where the faintest lightning suggested dawn was not far off. She was Eastern-born like you, came from Philadelphia as a young bride. My father met her on a cattle-buying trip and convinced her to come west with him. Was she happy here? Penelope asked, the question reflecting her own uncertainties. Not at first, from what I understand, Lucas admitted. She found it harsh and lonely, but she adapted, learned to see beauty in different places, built a life she came to love. He glanced at Penelope. She used to say that happiness isn't found in a place, but in what you build there. The words resonated with Penelope. Over the past 3 weeks, she had begun building something at Jameson Ranch, not just a garden or a cleaned cabin, but the foundations of a life with purpose, with tangible results she could see and touch. What would you build here, Lucas? She asked quietly, if I stayed. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the starlight. A partnership, a family, a legacy that would outlast us both. He hesitated, then added, love, Penelope. I would build a life filled with love. The simple declaration touched her deeply. This was so different from the marriage prospects she had faced in Boston, arrangements based on social standing, financial considerations, family connections. Lucas was offering something both simpler and more profound, a shared purpose, mutual respect, and affection that had grown naturally from working side by side. I'm afraid, she confessed in a whisper. Of what? He asked gently. Of making the wrong choice, of regret. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly chilled despite the mild night. Of failing at this life if I stay, or always wondering what might have been if I go. Lucas nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's fair, it's a big decision. He hesitated, then stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. Can I tell you what I think? Penelope nodded, curious. I think you're stronger than you know, he said simply. I think you've already proven you can thrive here, not just survive. I've watched you tackle everything from bread making to garden planting to facing down Elkins without backing down. A smile touched his lips. If anyone can build a life here and make it good, it's you. The confidence in his voice bolstered her. Lucas saw in her a strength and capability that even she hadn't fully recognized until coming to Montana. And if I choose to go, she asked, needing to understand the full measure of this man. Pain flashed briefly in his eyes, but his voice remained steady. Then I'll drive you to town myself and wish you happiness. And hope that maybe someday you'll write and let me know you found it. The generosity of spirit behind the words moved her deeply. Even facing the loss of her, Lucas was putting her welfare above his own desires. Impulsively, Penelope stepped forward and placed her hand against his cheek. His skin was warm beneath her palm, the slight stubble rough against her fingers. I don't deserve you, Lucas Jameson. He covered her hand with his own, turning his face slightly to press a kiss to her palm, a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. You deserve everything good in this world, Penelope. I'm just hoping you'll let me be the one to try to give it to you. The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with possibility. Penelope felt herself balanced on the edge of a decision that would change the course of her life irrevocably. Before she could speak, the first rays of dawn broke over the eastern ridge, bathing the valley in golden light. The ranch came alive around them, roosters crowing, cattle lowing, horses nickering for their morning feed. The day had begun, and with it, the countdown to the moment when she would have to give her uncle her decision. Lucas stepped back, releasing her hand reluctantly. I need to see to the morning chores, he said. You take whatever time you need. As he moved toward the barn, Penelope called after him. Lucas. He turned, the rising sun illuminating his face, highlighting the hope and fear warring in his eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." He nodded once, a small smile touching his lips, then continued on his way. Penelope watched him go, her heart full of emotions too complex to name. Returning to the cabin, she began her own morning routine, stoking the fire, preparing coffee, mixing dough for biscuits. The familiar task soothed her, giving her hands occupation while her mind worked through her decision. By the time Lucas returned from the barn, she had breakfast on the table and clarity in her heart. He entered, removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door, a small, domestic gesture that suddenly seemed profoundly significant. "Lucas," she said before he could speak, "I've made my decision." He froze, his eyes finding hers across the room. "All ready." Penelope nodded, moving toward him with purposeful steps. "I'm staying." For a moment he seemed unable to process her words. "You're staying." "Yes," she confirmed, a smile breaking across her face. "I'm staying here with you on the ranch." Joy bloomed in his eyes, transforming his face. "Penelope," he breathed, crossing the remaining distance between them in 2 strides. "Are you sure? What about Boston, your uncle's offer?" "Boston was my past," she said with newfound certainty. "This is my future. Here with you building something real." She took his hands in hers. "I want the partnership you offered, the family, the legacy." Lucas's hands tightened around hers. "And the love?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion. "Especially the love," she whispered. With a sound that was half laugh, half sob, Lucas pulled her into his arms. Penelope went willingly, melting against his solid strength. His embrace was gentle yet firm, protective yet freeing, everything she hadn't known she needed until this moment. "I'll make you happy," he promised against her hair. "Every day I'll try." "We'll make each other happy," she corrected, pulling back just enough to see his face. "Together." The love shining in his eyes was answer enough, but then he lowered his head slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. Instead, Penelope rose on her toes to meet him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, a tender exploration rather than a passionate claim. His lips were soft against hers, slightly chapped from sun and wind but infinitely careful. When they parted, Penelope felt as if something fundamental had shifted within her, as if pieces of herself that had been adrift had finally found their mooring. "I love you," Lucas said simply, the words both declaration and promise. "And I love you," Penelope replied, the truth of it resonating through her entire being. Enough to face down Elkins, angry uncles, and whatever else Montana throws our way. His laugh was joyous and unrestrained, a sound she had never heard from him before. He lifted her off her feet and spun her around once before setting her gently back down. "We should get married, right away, before your uncle tries to drag you back east." "Is that a proposal, Mr. Jameson?" She teased, though her heart raced at the thought. Lucas's expression sobered, and to Penelope's surprise, he dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hands in his. "Penelope Davenport, I may not be the sophisticated Eastern gentleman you deserve, but I promise to love you faithfully all the days of my life. I'll work until my hands bleed to make this ranch a home worthy of you. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears blurred Penelope's vision as she looked down at this man, young in years but old in responsibility, offering her not wealth or status but honest love and partnership. "Yes," she whispered, "yes, Lucas, I will marry you." He rose and kissed her again, this time with more confidence, his arms encircling her waist and drawing her close. Penelope wound her arms around his neck, returning his kiss with a fervor that surprised them both. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "Your uncle arrives in a few hours," he reminded her. "Are you ready to face him?" Penelope nodded. "Together we'll face him, and then we'll face everything else that comes our way." The remainder of the morning passed in a flurry of activity. Lucas rode out to inform Ezekiel and the ranch hands of their engagement, while Penelope prepared herself for her uncle's arrival. She chose her best dress, a blue gingham that, while simple by Boston standards, was clean and becoming. As midday approached, Lucas returned to the cabin, freshly shaved and wearing his best shirt. He had barely settled on the porch beside Penelope when the sound of approaching horses announced her uncle's arrival. Howard Davenport and Richardson rode into the yard, followed by a third man whom Penelope recognized as Reverend Thomas from the church in Clearwater. Her uncle's expression as he dismounted suggested he expected resistance and had come prepared for it. Penelope, he greeted her stiffly. I trust you've had sufficient time to consider my offer. She rose from her seat on the porch, feeling Lucas stand supportively beside her. I have, Uncle Howard, and I must decline. Her uncle's face darkened. You can't be serious. This infatuation with frontier life will fade quickly once the reality sets in. Winter here is brutal. The isolation will drive you mad. Perhaps, Penelope acknowledged calmly. But I won't be facing it alone. She took Lucas's hand, drawing strength from his solid presence. Lucas and I are to be married. Howard looked between them, incredulity giving way to anger. This is absurd. You barely know this man. And what of your position in society, your future? My future is here, Penelope replied with quiet certainty, with Lucas building something lasting. As for society, she shrugged. I've seen how quickly society turns its back when fortunes change. I prefer to place my trust in something more substantial. Richardson stepped forward, his tone reasonable. Miss Davenport, no one doubts that you've formed an attachment during your time here, but surely a hasty marriage is unnecessary. Return to Boston with us. If your feelings persist after a proper interval, arrangements could be made. Lucas, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. Sir, with respect, Penelope isn't a child to be managed. She's made her choice freely, and I intend to honor it by making her my wife. He nodded toward Reverend Thomas, who stood awkwardly beside the horses. Today, if she's willing. Today, Howard sputtered, this is outrageous, I forbid it. Penelope straightened her spine, meeting her uncle's gaze directly. I am 22 years old, Uncle Howard. I don't require your permission or your blessing, though I would prefer to have the latter. For a long moment, Howard Davenport stared at his niece, seeing perhaps for the first time not the dependent girl he had expected, but a woman who had found her own strength. His expression shifted, anger giving way to reluctant respect. You're as stubborn as your father, he said finally. He would be proud of you, I think. The unexpected acknowledgement brought tears to Penelope's eyes. Thank you, Uncle Howard. He sighed heavily. I suppose if you're determined on this course, the least I can do is give you a proper wedding. He gestured to Reverend Thomas. I've brought the minister, as you see, your Mr. Richardson and I can serve as witnesses. Penelope glanced at Lucas, who nodded, a smile breaking across his face. Today then, she agreed. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, conducted on the porch of the cabin that would be their home. Ezekiel arrived just in time, bringing wildflowers from the meadow for Penelope to hold. Lucas, standing tall and proud beside her, spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice that carried conviction with every word. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas kissed her with restrained tenderness, mindful of their audience. Even so, the touch of his lips on hers sealed a promise that Penelope felt to her very core. Howard Davenport, despite his initial opposition, insisted on providing a small celebration. He sent Richardson to town for supplies, and by evening the ranch yard had been transformed. Lanterns hung from trees, trestle tables groaned under food and drink, and a fiddler from town provided music for dancing. As the sun set on her wedding day, Penelope found herself standing slightly apart from the festivities, watching as Lucas conversed with her uncle. The two men, so different in background and manner, seemed to have reached an uneasy truce. She saw her uncle hand Lucas something, a small leather pouch that Lucas accepted with visible surprise. When Lucas rejoined her, his expression was thoughtful. Your uncle gave us a wedding gift, he said, opening the pouch to reveal a significant amount of money. He says it's your rightful share of what he recovered from your father's business. Penelope stared at the money, emotions warring within her. Part of her wanted to refuse it out of pride, but practicality prevailed. We can use it for the ranch, she decided. Perhaps hire more hands, make repairs to the buildings. Lucas nodded, tucking the pouch away. It would help, he admitted, but we would have managed without it. I know, Penelope said, slipping her arm through his. That's why I'm comfortable accepting it, because it's not a rescue, just a boost. He smiled down at her, pride evident in his eyes. Have I told you today that I love you, Mrs. Jameson? The new name sent a thrill through her. You have, but I wouldn't object to hearing it again. I love you, he murmured, bending to brush his lips against hers, and I will spend every day proving it. As night deepened and the celebration continued around them, Penelope leaned against her husband's solid strength, contentment filling her heart. The journey that had brought her to this remote Montana ranch had been born of desperation, but what she had found here was far more precious than mere security. She had found home. Epilogue. 5 years later. The summer sun beat down on Jameson Ranch, turning the meadow grass golden and warming the newly painted clapboards of the expanded ranch house. In the garden, now 3 times its original size, rows of vegetables thrived alongside beds of flowers that Penelope had insisted were as necessary as the practical crops. From her position on the wide front porch, Penelope watched as Lucas led a small boy of about 3 on a gentle pony, circling the corral with patient steps. The child, dark-haired like his father but with Penelope's delicate features, sat straight in the saddle, his small hands clutching the pommel with determined concentration. "Look, Mama," he called, spotting her on the porch. "I'm riding like Papa." "I see, James," she called back, waving. "You're doing wonderfully." Lucas glanced up, a smile spreading across his face as he saw her. 5 years of marriage had only deepened the connection between them, each challenge and triumph binding them more closely together. The lean, uncertain young rancher had matured into a man of substance, respected throughout the territory for his integrity and business acumen. The ranch had prospered under their joint management. The money from Howard Davenport had indeed been used to hire additional hands and make improvements to the buildings, but it was Lucas and Penelope's shared vision and hard work that had truly transformed Jameson Ranch. The herd was now twice its original size, the boundary disputes with Elkins settled permanently through a combination of legal action and eventual mutual respect. Penelope shifted in her rocking chair, one hand resting on her swollen belly where their second child grew. The first years had been hard, filled with adjustments and occasional doubts. Winter had indeed proven brutal, the isolation sometimes oppressive. Yet for every hardship there had been compensating joys, the quiet evenings by the fire, the satisfaction of shared accomplishment, the deep, abiding love that had grown between them. Howard Davenport had returned to Boston after their wedding, but not before extracting a promise that they would visit when circumstances allowed. 2 years later they had made the journey east, little James just beginning to walk. The visit had confirmed what Penelope already knew, that while Boston would always be a part of her past, her future lay in Montana. "Penny, for your thoughts," came a gruff voice beside her. Penelope smiled up at Ezekiel, now more stooped but still a vital presence on the ranch. The old man had become like family, a grandfather figure to James, and a repository of wisdom for both Lucas and Penelope. "Just counting my blessings," she replied. "They're numerous." Ezekiel lowered himself into the chair beside hers with a grunt. "Never thought I'd live to see this place thrive like it has." Old Lucas had the vision but not the steadiness. Young Lucas had the steadiness but needed the heart you brought. Penelope reached over to pat his weathered hand. "You're a wise man, Ezekiel Hansen." "Nah," he demurred, "just old enough to recognize when something's working right." He nodded toward Lucas and James. "That boy of yours is going to be a fine horseman." Like his father, Penelope agreed, watching as Lucas lifted James from the pony, swinging him high in the air to delighted squeals before setting him on his shoulders for the walk back to the house. As they approached the porch, Penelope's heart swelled with love and gratitude. This life, so different from anything she had imagined for herself, had proven richer and more fulfilling than any fate Boston society might have offered her. Lucas ascended the porch steps, setting James down to run to Penelope's side. "Mama, Papa says when the baby comes, I can help take care of it," the little boy announced, leaning against her knee. "Of course you can," Penelope assured him, smoothing his dark hair. "You'll be a wonderful big brother." Lucas bent to kiss her, his hand gently covering hers on her belly. "How are you feeling?" "Well," she replied honestly. "Very well." He smiled, the expression lighting his eyes, eyes that still looked at her with the same wonder and love they had when she first agreed to stay. "Good, because I have news. The cattle buyer from Chicago has agreed to our price. The biggest sale we've ever made." Penelope squeezed his hand, sharing in his triumph. "That's wonderful, Lucas. It means we can build that schoolroom you've been wanting," he said. "For James and this little one, and maybe the Petersons' children too. A proper education, right here on the ranch." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply. Lucas never forgot that she valued learning, that she wanted their children to have opportunities that stretched beyond the boundaries of the ranch. "Thank you," she said softly, "for always understanding what matters to me." "As you understand what matters to me," he replied, his voice equally soft. 5 years had taught them the language of partnership, the give and take of two lives woven into one shared purpose. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the yard, the family gathered for supper in the dining room that had been added to the original cabin. The table, large enough to accommodate ranch hands and occasional visitors, was the heart of the home Penelope and Lucas had built together. Later, with James tucked into bed and Ezekiel retired to his improved cabin behind the barn, Penelope and Lucas sat together on the porch swing, watching as stars appeared in the darkening sky. His arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him, they existed in the comfortable silence of those who no longer need words to communicate their deepest feelings. "Do you ever regret it?" Lucas asked suddenly, breaking the silence, "choosing this life over Boston?" Penelope looked up at him, surprised by the question after so many years. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment." He studied her face in the fading light, as if searching for any hint of reservation. "Even during that first winter, when the blizzard trapped us for weeks and the roof leaked and you were sick with worry about the cattle." "Even then," she assured him, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "Because you were there, facing it with me. We weathered it together, just as we've weathered everything since." Lucas caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm in a gesture that echoed their conversation on the porch 5 years earlier, the night she had decided to stay. "I still wake up sometimes amazed that you're beside me," he confessed. "That you chose this life, chose me." "Best choice I ever made," Penelope said simply. She guided his hand to her belly where their unborn child stirred. "Feel that, that's our future, Lucas, our legacy. This ranch, these children, the life we've built, it's more than I ever dreamed possible." His eyes, still that same clear blue that had first caught her attention in Hammond's store, filled with emotion. "I love you, Penelope Jameson. More with each passing day." "And I love you," she replied, the words as fresh and true as the first time she had spoken them. "My handsome young rancher who reached out his hand and helped me step into a new life." As Lucas bent to kiss her under the vast Montana sky, Penelope reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from desperate mail-order bride to beloved wife, mother, and partner. The path had not always been smooth, but every step had led to this moment of perfect contentment. In the end, home wasn't Boston or Montana. Home was wherever they were together, building their future one day at a time, hand in hand.